My name is Alex Turner, and I've been wearing the badge of homicide detective on my chest for 15 years. I've seen a bit of everything in this city, from bar fights that ended badly to crimes of passion that made you lose faith in humanity. But nothing, not even in my worst nightmares, prepared me for the case that would become known as the Shadow Killer. It all started with a series of brutal killings, always during solar eclipses. At first, no one connected the dots. They thought they were coincidences, random crimes. But I felt there was something wrong, something sinister in the air. It was as if the very darkness that overtook the city during the eclipse brought with it a palpable evil, a predator on the prowl. The victims were always found in the first few hours after the eclipse. Ordinary people, with no declared enemies and no apparent connection between them. The press, of course, went wild. Headlines screamed about a new serial killer, and panic gripped the city. With each eclipse, fear spread like a virus, and the streets became deserted, houses locked up, everyone praying they wouldn't be next. I threw myself headlong into the case. I spent sleepless nights poring over crime scene photos, autopsy reports, and witness statements. The more I investigated, the more disturbed I became. There was something strange about these deaths, something that went beyond comprehension, something that defied logic. And then there were the shadows, moving in impossible ways. I needed help. I needed someone who could see beyond the obvious, who could help me decipher her ability to get inside the minds of criminals, to draw up detailed psychological profiles that helped the police catch the most cunning murderers. I set up a meeting with her in my office, a cramped, poorly lit cubicle in the basement of the police station. I spread the photos of the victims out on the table, along with the reports and notes I had made. Emma analyzed everything with a clinical eye, her face serious and focused. "It's peculiar, Detective," she said after a long silence. "The way the victims are found, the absence of a clear pattern, the shadows, everything points to something out of the ordinary." "I know," I replied, running my hand through my hair, already feeling the frustration overwhelm me. "But what? An assassin who only attacks during eclipses? That doesn't make any sense." "Perhaps the meaning lies precisely in the lack of meaning," she pondered, picking up one of the photos and looking at it more closely. "Maybe the eclipse is more than a trigger. Maybe it's part of the ritual." Ritual? The word sounded strange, almost archaic. But coming from Emma, I knew it wasn't a shot in the dark. "Do you think we're dealing with some kind of cult?" I asked skeptically. "Not necessarily an organized sect," she replied, "but perhaps someone who believes in something ancient, something linked to darkness, to eclipses, to an occult power, a flesh and blood killer that I hadn't considered the possibility of something more supernatural." Meanwhile, someone else was also sniffing out this case, but in different ways. Sarah Miller, an investigative journalist with whom I had already crossed paths on other cases. Sarah was dogged, intelligent, and had a special nose for unearthing the truth, even if it meant getting into trouble. She was obsessed with the Shadow Killer, and I knew she wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth. One day, Sarah showed up at the police station with her characteristic manner of not asking permission, and threw an old newspaper on my desk. "Have you seen this, Alex?" she asked with a twinkle in her eye. "I found it in a bookstore downtown. It's from 1923, and look at the headline." The paper was yellowed and the edges frayed, but the headline was clear. "The Terror of the Eclipse. Dark. Assassin strikes again." "History repeats itself, Alex," said Sarah, pointing to the article. "Deaths during the eclipse, strange shadows in the photos, panic in the city. It seems our killer has a predecessor." It came as a shock. The idea that the Shadow Killer was not a new phenomenon, but something that had haunted the city for generations, was disturbing. Sarah had found a connection to the past, a clue that could lead us to the truth. We started investigating together, even if unofficially. Sarah delved into the historical archives, looking for more records of similar crimes. I focused on the recent victims, trying to find any details that might have gone unnoticed. One of the victims, a young man called Michael, had survived one of the attacks, but was in a coma and not expected to get better. I decided to visit him in hospital in the hope that, even though he was unconscious, he might give me a clue. The hospital room was silent and gloomy. Michael was lying in bed, pale and motionless, hooked up to a series of devices that monitored his vital signs. I stood next to him, watching his chest rise and fall slowly, and spoke, even though I knew he probably couldn't hear me. "I'll catch whoever did this to you, Michael," I said quietly. "I promise." Suddenly, one of the monitors started beeping. Michael's heartbeat was racing, and his body was twitching slightly. The nurses rushed into the room, trying to stabilize him, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. I saw it. In the corner of the room, in the dim light, a shadow was moving. A shadow that shouldn't have been there. A shadow that lengthened and distorted, as if it were alive. "He's here," I whispered, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "The killer is here." But before I could react, the shadow disappeared. The monitors returned to normal and Michael calmed down. The nurses looked at me strangely, and I realized that I had spoken aloud. I left the hospital in a daze, certain that Emma was right. This wasn't just a police case. It was something much more sinister. Something that involved the very essence of darkness, and the next eclipse was approaching. The experience at the hospital with Michael, the coma victim, left me deeply shaken. The sight of that shadow moving in the corner of the room, the way the equipment reacted, all this confirmed my darkest suspicions. We were dealing with no ordinary killer. The shadow killer was something much more sinister, something that, until then, I had only read about in horror books. I needed to share this with Emma and Sarah. I called them both for a meeting in my apartment, a small and messy place that served as my private refuge. As I prepared a strong coffee, trying to organize my thoughts, I could feel the weight of the case crushing me. "I saw it," I told them, as soon as they had settled down on the battered sofa. "In the hospital, I saw the shadow. It moved, squirmed, as if it were alive." Emma, always analytical, frowned. "Are you sure, Alex? Stress? Lack of sleep? Can all cause hallucinations." "I know what I saw, Emma," I insisted, pouring the cups of coffee. "And that's not all." The devices monitoring Michael went crazy when the shadow appeared, as if they were picking up some kind of energy or interference. Sarah, who had been listening in silence until then, leaned forward, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and excitement. "This matches what I found," she said, opening her backpack and pulling out a tangle of old papers and old photos. "Look at this." She spread the material out on the coffee table. They were copies of old newspaper articles, witness accounts, and even some pen and ink drawings, all dating back decades, even centuries. And in all of them, the same story. Deaths during eclipses, mysterious shadows, and an irrational fear that gripped the city. Alleyway. And in some of these cases, there were survivors. People who managed to escape, but who were scarred, marked. The word echoed in my mind, bringing back the memory of Michael, lying in that hospital bed, unconscious, but still somehow connected to the darkness. We decided that we needed to find one of these survivors, someone who had faced the shadow killer and lived to tell the tale. Perhaps this person could give us some clue, some crucial piece of information that would help us understand what we were up against. Sarah, with her investigative skills, managed to track down the whereabouts of an elderly woman who had escaped an attack during an eclipse in the 1970s. She lived in a retirement home on the outskirts of the city, and we arranged a visit for the following day. The journey to the rest home was silent. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to digest the magnitude of what we were investigating. It was no longer just a murder case. It was something much bigger, something that spanned generations, something that seemed to be deeply rooted in our city's history. We found the lady, whose name was Elizabeth, in a wheelchair in a sunny garden inside the institution. She was frail and wrinkled, but her eyes still shone with a sharp intelligence. Emma introduced herself, explaining that we were investigating the recent murders, and that we had found reports of her meeting a figure similar to what the media called the Shadow Killer. Elizabeth shuddered when she heard the name. Her eyes were fixed on a distant point, as if she were reliving an old nightmare. "He came with the darkness," she whispered, her voice weak and hoarse. "A shadow that moved like a man, but it wasn't a man." She told her story with a wealth of detail that gave me goosebumps. She was just a young girl at the time, returning home late at night when the eclipse began. Suddenly, she found herself surrounded by a thick, suffocating darkness, and inside her, the shadow formed. "He fed off my fear," said Elizabeth, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "The more terrified I became, the stronger he became." She described the sensation of being drained, of having her vital energy sucked out by the creature. She only managed to escape because, in a moment of desperation, she grabbed a piece of broken metal from a fence and drove it into the shadows. The creature retreated, letting out a high-pitched, unearthly scream, and disappeared into the darkness. Elizabeth fainted and was found hours later, on the verge of death. "He's not human," Elizabeth repeated, staring at us. "He is darkness itself, and he will return whenever the shadow of the eclipse touches this earth." Elizabeth's words confirmed our worst suspicions. The shadow killer was not just a man, but an entity, a being made of pure darkness who fed off the fear and life energy of his victims. We left the retirement home in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Elizabeth's story had given us a new perspective, but it had also opened up an abyss of unanswered questions. How could we fight something that wasn't made of flesh and blood? How could we stop a creature that fed on fear itself? Back in the city, I met with Officer James Harris, my partner in the investigation. James was an experienced and reliable police officer, but skeptical by nature. I knew he would have a hard time believing it all, but I needed his help. I told him about the visit to Elizabeth, about the story of the shadow creature, about the connection with the eclipses. James listened in silence, his face impassive. "Are you serious, Alex?" he asked when I'd finished. "Do you really believe that?" "I don't know what to believe, James," I admitted. "But I know there's something very wrong going on, and I know we need to be prepared for anything." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Alex, I respect you, but this is all crazy. Living shadows, ancient entities, there's no such thing." "I didn't think so either," I said, "until I saw it with my own eyes." Despite his skepticism, James agreed to help me. He knew that I wasn't given to fantasies, and that if I was taking it seriously, it was because something really strange was going on. We began to put together a plan for the next eclipse, which would take place in less than a week. The idea of a creature from the shadows on the loose during total darkness was terrifying, and I knew we needed to do everything in our power to protect the city. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her research into the ancient murders linked to the eclipses. She discovered something even more disturbing. An ancient secret society known as the Heralds of the Shadow, when the veil between our world and the Shadow Realm became thinner. They performed rituals during eclipses in an attempt to summon and control the creatures that inhabited this realm. They believed they could use the power of the shadows to gain knowledge and power, Sarah explained, showing me a dusty old book full of strange symbols and incomprehensible diagrams. "But something went wrong," I added, putting the pieces together. "The ritual got out of control, and the creature broke free." "Exactly," said Sarah. "And now, with every eclipse, it returns, looking for victims to feed on." Sarah's discovery changed everything. We now had a name for our enemy, a context for his actions. The Shadow Killer was not just a random creature, but an ancient entity, linked to forgotten rituals and a secret society that worshipped it. And if the Heralds of the Shadow were right, the creature's power was growing with each eclipse, which meant that the next eclipse would be the most dangerous of all. I felt an enormous weight on my shoulders. The fate of the city, perhaps the world, depended on us. We had to find a way to stop the Shadow Killer before he plunged everyone into eternal darkness, and time was running out. The clock seemed to mock us. Every tick was a reminder that the eclipse was approaching, and with it, the threat of the Shadow Killer was becoming more real, more palpable. The whole city seemed to be in suspense, a collective fear hanging in the air like a dense fog. People avoided leaving their homes. The streets were deserted at the slightest sign of a shadow, and with each passing day, the tension only grew. I felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my back. The responsibility of protecting the city, of stopping a creature that seemed straight out of a nightmare, was overwhelming. I spent sleepless nights studying the records of the ancient secret society, the Heralds of the Shadow that Sarah had discovered. The more I read, the more disturbed I became. The rituals they performed were bizarre, sinister, involving sacrifices and invocations to entities that, according to them, inhabited a place they called the Kingdom of Shadows, a place of eternal darkness, where time and space had no meaning. And according to their writings, the Shadow Killer was one of these entities, a being of pure evil who had been brought to our world during an eclipse centuries ago. Emma, despite her initial skepticism, was now totally immersed in the research. She spent hours analyzing the creature's behavior patterns, trying to draw up a psychological profile of something that essentially didn't have a human mind. It's fascinating and terrifying at the same time, she told me one day as we studied the ancient texts together. This creature doesn't think like us. It's driven by basic instincts: hunger, fear, darkness, and according to these records, it becomes stronger with each eclipse. The idea that the Shadow Killer was getting more powerful with each appearance was terrifying. If we couldn't stop him during the next eclipse, he might become too strong to be stopped. Meanwhile, Sarah, with her characteristic obstinacy, managed to track down what seemed to be the last stronghold of the Heralds of the Shadow in the city, an old abandoned building on the outskirts, which, according to her, was used as a kind of temple by the secret society. We decided that we needed to investigate the place. Maybe we could find something there, some clue, some weapon that could help us stop the creature. I called James, my partner, to accompany us. He was still skeptical about the whole story of dark entities and ancient rituals, but after everything we had seen, he could no longer deny that something very strange was going on. "I still think you're overreacting," he said, as we drove towards the abandoned building. "But I'll be there to cover your back if things get ugly." The Temple of the Heralds of Shadow was a decaying and sinister place, an old Victorian mansion with broken windows, peeling walls, and an air of abandonment that seemed to have seeped into every brick, every plank of wood. We entered cautiously, the flashlights cutting through the darkness in flickering beams. The interior was covered in dust and cobwebs, and the silence was so deep that it was oppressive, indicated that the place had indeed been a center of activity for the secret society. In the basement, we found something that gave us goosebumps. It was a circular chamber, with stone walls covered in carvings depicting shadowy figures, similar to the one Elizabeth had described. And in the center of the chamber, there was a deep, dark well that seemed to extend into the bowels of the earth. "This is it," said Sarah, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where they performed the rituals." I approached the well, feeling a chill run down my spine. I looked down, but the darkness was total. You couldn't see the bottom. It was as if we were looking into the abyss itself. Suddenly, Emma, who was examining the carvings on the wall, let out a muffled scream. "Alex, look at this," she called out, pointing to one of the symbols. "It's the same symbol that was in the diary you found. And, look, it's repeated in several places." I approached and examined the symbol. It was a distorted spiral, with a series of lines radiating from the center. It looked familiar, but I couldn't remember where I'd seen it before. That's when I remembered. The hospital. Michael's room. The symbol was there, drawn in crayon on a piece of paper that was stuck to the wall next to the bed. "Michael," I muttered, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "He saw that symbol. He drew that symbol." "What does that mean?" asked James, confused. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think Michael was somehow connected to the Heralds of the Shadow, or at least to the creature they summoned." The discovery left us even more disturbed. What could a young man, the victim of a brutal attack, have to do with an ancient secret society and its dark rituals? We decided that we needed to go back to the hospital and try to get more information about Michael, even if he was still in a coma. On the way back, as we passed one of the few lighted stretches of road, Emma, who was sitting in the back seat, suddenly grabbed my arm tightly. "Alex, stop the car," she said, urgency in her voice. I braked abruptly, startled. "What is it, Emma?" She pointed outside the window, down a dark alley between two buildings. "I saw something," she said, her voice trembling. "A shadow. It moved, too fast to be human." James and I exchanged a look. Was the creature following us? Did it know we were getting closer to the truth? We decided to investigate. We got out of the car, guns in hand, and cautiously approached the alley. The darkness there seemed denser, deeper, as if it were absorbing the little light coming from the street. We entered the alley, the flashlights cutting through the shadows. The air was cold and damp, and a strange smell, like metal and ozone, hung in the air. Suddenly, we heard a sound. A whisper, low and guttural, that seemed to come from all directions at once. "What was that?" asked James, his voice tense. "I don't know," I replied, "but I don't like it at all." We kept going until, at the end of the alley, we saw something move. A dark, indistinct shape, writhing and wriggling as if it were alive. The shadow. "Stand still," I ordered, pointing my gun at the creature. "Don't move." The shadow didn't obey. It began to approach, slowly, sliding across the floor, like an oil slick spreading. James fired, but the bullets seemed to pass through the creature without having any effect. The shadow continued to advance, ever closer. "It's no use," shouted Emma. "The guns won't work on her." Sense of absolute terror. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, backing towards the exit of the alley. "Now!" We ran back to the car, with the shadow following close behind. We got into the car, and I hit the gas, leaving behind the alley and the creature that inhabited it. We drove in silence for a long time, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we had just witnessed. "That was," began James, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was the shadow killer, wasn't it?" "It was," I confirmed, with a lump in my throat. "And he's more powerful than we imagined." The encounter in the alley had been a wake-up call, a brutal reminder that we were dealing with something far beyond our comprehension, something that could not be stopped with conventional methods. And the eclipse was coming. In just a few days, the city would be plunged into total darkness, and the shadow killer would be on the loose, stronger than ever. We needed to prepare. We needed to find a way to stop him before it was too late. But how? How to fight a creature made of shadows, which fed on fear and darkness itself? I didn't have the answers, but I knew I had to find them, quickly. The encounter with the shadow in the alley was a turning point. From that moment on, there was no more room for doubt or skepticism. The shadow killer was real, and the threat he posed was far greater than any of us had imagined. We returned to the hospital, determined to get more information from Michael, the coma victim. I felt that he was the key to understanding what was going on. Dr. Reynolds, using her skills as a psychologist, suggested a daring approach: hypnosis. "It's risky," she told me as we walked through the silent corridors of the hospital. "He's in a fragile state, and we don't know how his mind might react. But if we can access the memories of the attack, we might find something that can help us." I agreed without hesitation. We were running out of time, and we needed all the information we could get. With the reluctant permission of the doctors, Emma carried out the hypnosis session at Michael's bedside. She used a deep relaxation technique, guiding the young man's mind through a series of verbal commands, trying to access the traumatic memories that were locked away in his subconscious. At first, Michael didn't respond, but gradually his breathing became more agitated. His body twitched slightly, and he began to mumble disconnected words. "Darkness," he whispered. "So much darkness. Cold. He's coming." Emma continued, encouraging him to talk, to describe what he was seeing, and little by little the story began to form. Michael described the night of the attack. He was driving home late at night when the eclipse began. Suddenly, he found himself surrounded by a thick darkness. Not the normal darkness of night, but something deeper, more ancient. "I couldn't breathe," he whispered, his voice filled with terror. It was as if the darkness itself was suffocating me. And then he saw the shadow, a dark, shapeless figure with glowing red eyes, moving towards him, slithering along the ground like a snake. "He wanted something from me," said Michael. "He wanted my energy, my life." Michael described how the creature attacked him, how he felt his life force being drained, how he struggled but couldn't defend himself. And then he mentioned the symbol, the circle, he whispered. "The circle with the spiral. He showed me the circle. It was the same symbol we had found in the Temple of the Heralds of the Shadow and on Michael's drawing in the hospital. The symbol that was somehow linked to the creature and the ancient rituals. Suddenly, Michael began to scream. His body contorted violently, and the monitors around him began beeping frantically. "He's here!" he shouted. "He's coming to get me! Don't let him take me!" Emma stopped the session immediately, and the nurses rushed into the room, trying to calm Michael down. He had gone into a state of extreme panic, and it took hours for the doctors to stabilize him. The hypnosis session had been a success and a failure at the same time. We had managed to obtain valuable information about the creature and its connection to the symbol, but we had also put Michael in danger, and now he was worse off than before. I felt guilty. Guilty for having pushed Michael. Guilty for having brought up memories that were perhaps better left forgotten. But there was no time for regrets. We needed to act, and fast. We gathered all the information we had, the records of the Heralds of the Shadow, Elizabeth's descriptions, Michael's account, the symbol. Everything pointed to a single conclusion. The creature was an entity from the Shadow Realm, and the rituals performed during eclipses were the key to opening a portal between our world and theirs. "They wanted to bring the creature into our world," said Sarah, as we studied the ancient texts in my apartment. "They wanted to use its power." But something went wrong, Emma added. The ritual was interrupted, and the creature became trapped between the two worlds. It can only fully manifest itself during eclipses, when the barrier between the dimensions is weaker. And now, she's getting stronger with every eclipse, I added, feeling a chill run down my spine. She wants to finish what the Herald started. She wants to open the portal permanently. The idea was terrifying. If the creature managed to open the portal, there would be no turning back. Our world would be flooded with darkness, and humanity would be doomed. "Is there any way to stop this?" asked James, his voice tense. "Perhaps," replied Emma, thoughtfully. "According to the records, the Heralds of Shadow also had a ritual to banish the creatures back to the Shadow Realm. A counter-ritual, so to speak. But they never used it, right?" I asked. "Because they wanted to keep the creature here." "Exactly," said Emma. "But not us. We want to get rid of it. And maybe, if can perform the ritual during the eclipse, we can banish the creature back to its realm and close the portal once and for all." It was a risky, desperate plan, but it was the only chance we had. We needed to find the details of the counter-ritual, prepare for the ceremony, and perform it during the peak of the eclipse, when the creature's energy was at its highest. Fragments of information, vague descriptions, complex symbols, and diagrams. It was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. But little by little, the ritual began to take shape. We discovered that the ritual had to be performed in a specific place, a point where energy converged, where the veil between the worlds was thinnest. And according to the records, this place was the same where the heralds performed their rituals, the well in the basement of the old temple. We also discovered that the ritual required an object of power, a catalyst that could channel the energy of the eclipse and direct it towards the creature. An object that, according to the texts, had been lost for centuries. "Great," grumbled James. "So, as well as performing an ancient ritual and facing a creature from the shadows, we also need to find a lost artifact. This just gets better and better." I knew he was right. The odds were against us. But I couldn't give up. Not now. We continued our research, and after hours of study, Sarah made a crucial discovery. She found a reference to an object called the Moonstone, a crystal that, according to legend, had been used by the Heralds of the Shadow in their rituals. "They say that the stone was stolen from the temple many years ago," said Sarah, reading aloud a passage from an old diary. "And that it was hidden somewhere in the city so that its power wouldn't fall into the wrong hands." "Maybe that's our weapon," said Emma hopefully. "If we can find the Moonstone, maybe we can use it in the ritual to banish the creature." It was a clue, a small light at the end of the tunnel, and I clung to it with all my might. We began a frantic search for the Moonstone. We scoured historical archives, libraries, museums, anywhere that might contain information about the object. And finally, after days of exhaustive research, we found a clue. An old map of the city, dating from the 18th century, showed the location of a property that belonged to one of the leaders of the Heralds of the Shadow. And on the map, there was an annotation next to the property. Here lies the Moonstone, kept for eternity. It was a long shot, but it was our only chance. We decided to go to the site, hoping that the stone was still there, waiting to be found. The address took us to a remote area on the outskirts of the city, where once there had been large farms, but which was now taken over by abandoned factories and wastelands. The property itself was a ruin, an old mansion that had been consumed by time and neglect. We entered cautiously, the lanterns cutting through the darkness. The interior of the mansion was a maze of dusty corridors and decaying halls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath our feet and the rustle of curtains torn by the wind. We explored the mansion, room by room, looking for any sign of the Moonstone. And finally, in the basement, behind a false wall, we found an ancient safe made of solid iron. The safe was locked, but James, with his experience in burglary, managed to open it after a few minutes of tense work. Inside the chest, on a faded velvet cushion, was the Moonstone. It was a fist-sized crystal of a pale blue hue that glowed with a soft, ethereal light. As I touched it, I felt a wave of energy run through my body, a sensation of tingling and warmth that spread through my limbs. "That's her," said Emma, with reverence in her voice. The Moonstone. We finally had the catalyst for the ritual in our hands, the object that could give us a fighting chance against the creature from the shadows. But time was running out. The eclipse was only a few hours away. We needed to return to the Temple of the Heralds, prepare the ritual, and wait for darkness to arrive. As we walked out of the mansion, with the Moonstone held in my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that came over me. The final showdown was approaching, and I knew that this time there would be no escape. Either we would win, or we would be consumed by the shadows. With the Moonstone in my possession, we hurried back to the Temple of the Heralds of Shadow. The sky was already beginning to darken, the first signs of the eclipse showing as a sinister shadow slowly devoured the sun. The city seemed to be holding its breath, a tense, expectant silence hanging in the air. We arrived at the temple when darkness was almost total. We descended into the basement, where the deep pit in the center of the circular chamber seemed even more threatening under the flickering light of our lanterns. The air was cold and heavy, charged with an energy that made our skin tingle and the hairs on the back of our necks stand on end. "This is it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's prepare the ritual." Following the fragmentary instructions we had found in ancient texts, we drew the circle of banishment around the well, using a mixture of salt and chalk as instructed. We placed the Moonstone in the center of the circle, where it immediately began to glow more brightly, pulsating with an ethereal blue light. Emma, who had delved deeper into the rituals, took the lead, reciting the ancient words in a language I didn't recognize, but which seemed to vibrate with an ancient energy. Sarah and James stood guard at the entrance to the chamber, weapons in hand, ready to face anything that came their way. I stood next to Emma, holding the Moonstone, feeling its power coursing through my body, preparing myself for the final confrontation. As the eclipse reached its peak, the darkness became absolute. It was as if we were in the center of nothingness, surrounded by an infinite void. And then the well began to glow. A sinister red light emanated from its depths, growing in intensity by the second. The air became colder, heavier, and a fetid smell like sulfur and rotting flesh permeated the room. "He's coming," said Emma, her voice trembling slightly, but keeping her concentration on the ritual. Suddenly the red light exploded, and a dark shape began to emerge from the pit. It was the creature, the shadow, killer, in all its terrible glory. A humanoid but distorted figure made of pure darkness, with long, thin arms that ended in sharp claws, and red eyes that glowed with an ancient fury. The creature was even more terrifying than in dreams or ancient descriptions. Its mere presence seemed to drain the light and life from its surroundings. The shadow roared, a guttural, non-human sound that made the chamber shake. It launched itself towards us with impressive speed, ready to annihilate us. "Now, Alex!" shouted Emma. "The Moonstone!" I lifted the stone, feeling its power pulsing in my hand. The blue light intensified, forming a protective shield. Around us, repelling the creature's darkness. The shadow stepped back in surprise, but then attacked again, raking the light shield with its claws. With each blow, the shield shook, and I felt my energy draining away, being drained by the creature. "We won't last long," shouted James, firing his gun at the shadow with no apparent effect. I knew he was right. We needed to finish the ritual, and quickly. "Emma, what do I do?" I asked, my voice hoarse with effort. "Concentrate the stone's energy on the symbol," she replied, pointing to the circle of banishment drawn on the ground. "Direct it towards the center, where the lines cross." I concentrated, gathering all my willpower, all my energy, and directed the power of the moonstone into the center of the symbol. Blue light poured out of the stone, forming an intense beam that hit the symbol squarely. The symbol glowed brightly, and the circle of banishment began to rotate, slowly at first, but gaining speed. With every second, the chamber shook, and a loud, piercing hum filled the air. The creature roared again, feeling the power of the ritual growing. It struggled, writhing, trying to free itself, but the circle of banishment was pulling it, slowly, but surely towards the pit. "It's working!" cried Sarah, with a mixture of relief and disbelief in her voice. But the fight was far from over. The creature resisted, using all its strength to keep itself out of the pit. I could feel my body weakening, my vision dimming, but I couldn't give up. Not now. "We need more energy," shouted Emma. "Everyone, focus on the symbol. Send your energy to the stone." James and Sarah joined me, placing their hands over mine, channeling their energies into the moonstone. I could feel their strength mixing with mine, strengthening the beam of light, intensifying the power of the ritual. The creature let out one last scream of agony, a sound that seemed to tear reality itself apart, before finally being sucked into the pit. The red light went out, and the creature's darkness was replaced by the blue glow of the moonstone. The banishing circles stopped spinning, and the humming ceased. Silence reigned in the chamber again, a heavy silence filled with exhaustion and relief. We had succeeded. We had banished the Shadow Killer back to his realm. But the victory had a bitter taste. We were exhausted, wounded, shaken to the core, and we knew that the creature was still out there, somewhere, waiting for another chance to return. The eclipse began to wane, and the first rays of sunlight appeared on the horizon, dispelling the darkness and bringing new hope. We staggered out of the temple into the daylight. The city seemed to have woken up from a nightmare, people coming out of their houses, looking up at the sky with a mixture of fear and wonder. We had survived, but at what cost? In the months that followed, life tried to return to normal. The city recovered from the terror, people gradually forgot their fear, and the Shadow Killer became just an urban legend, a story told to scare children. But we knew the truth. We knew that the darkness was still out there, lurking, waiting for the next eclipse, the next opportunity to break free. James returned to his normal police duties, but he was never the same again. He became more reclusive, darker, haunted by what he had seen. Sarah wrote an article about the secret society, the Heralds of the Shadow, and their rituals, but omitted the supernatural details, fearing disbelief and ridicule. She became a kind of guardian of the truth, a silent sentinel, always on the lookout for signs that the darkness might return. Emma continued her work as a psychologist, but now with a new focus, helping people deal with unexplained traumas, irrational fears, the feeling that something invisible was watching them in the shadows. And I remained a detective, but now I saw the city through different eyes. I knew that beneath the surface of normality, beneath the facade of tranquility, there were dark secrets, hidden forces that most people preferred to ignore. I became a silent guardian, a protector against the shadows, always vigilant, always prepared for the return of darkness, because I knew it would come back. Maybe not during the next eclipse, or the next, but one day, when we least expected it, the shadow of the Shadow Killer would once again stretch over the city, and I would be there, waiting, ready to fight, ready to protect, because that was my curse, and my mission. The Moonstone? I kept it in a safe place, away from prying eyes, away from the wrong hands. A constant reminder of the power we had faced, and the responsibility we carried. Some nights, when the city is silent and the moon is hidden behind the clouds, I pick up the stone and watch it glow in my hands. And for a moment, I can feel the darkness outside, pulsing, waiting, planning its return. But as long as I'm alive, as long as I'm breathing, I won't let that happen. I am the guardian, the protector, the light in the darkness, and I'll be ready. Always ready. Because the battle against the shadows never ends. It just begins again. With every eclipse, every night, every whisper in the dark. And I'll be there to face it, right to the end.